At precisely 10:02 a.m., sunlight sliced through the stained glass windows of St. Andrew's Church in Beverly Hills, illuminating a crowd dressed in black silk and tailored suits. In the pews, faces glimmered with tears, but not everyone was truly mourning. The air was heavy with lilies, perfume, and a secret that had yet to shatter the illusion of grief. This was not just a funeral. It was a spectacle, the final act in the public life of Richard Mason, the tech king whose rise from nothing had made headlines in every major business journal in America. And yet, the most powerful man in the room was nowhere to be found, at least not yet. Brandon Mason, standing beside the closed mahogany casket, played his part with conviction. His eyes shimmered, shoulders trembling ever so slightly, every movement crafted for maximum effect under the cameras and the gaze of half the city's elite. The murmurs of comfort, the warm hands on his back, the whispered condolences, they all fed a quiet fire inside him. In that moment, Brandon looked every inch the grieving son, but beneath the mask his pulse raced with anticipation. He was about to become the heir to an $80 million legacy, an empire built on his father's sweat, but about to be inherited through a single, devastating lie. Outside, the sky above Los Angeles was a sheet of blue, serene and uncaring. Inside, the atmosphere grew tenser with every second. The minister spoke in soothing tones about loss, about faith and legacy, about Richard Mason's generosity and drive. Brandon lowered his head, letting the words wash over him, barely hearing them. He was thinking about the future. A future where he no longer had to answer to the man who'd always demanded more, always doubted his choices, always seemed to see through every excuse, every secret. All eyes were on the casket, its bronze handles catching the light. Some wondered aloud, quietly, whether the rumors were true. Had Richard's death in Zurich really been so sudden? Why had there been no hospital visitation, no public statement? But the presence of Brandon, and the seal of official paperwork, had swept aside doubts. Those who questioned simply reminded themselves that grief is strange and unpredictable, and that the Mason family had always kept their own counsel. Near the front, Brandon's hands were clenched tight, his nails biting into his palms. He thought of the steps he had taken, each one more audacious than the last. Accessing private records, faking signatures, persuading his father's most trusted associates that he had Richard's blessing for every little detail. The death certificate had been filed with expert precision. The lawyer had been convinced, the bank accounts frozen, the assets slowly funneling toward him, just as he'd planned. It was perfect. It was flawless. And yet, as the organist began to play the closing hymn, a strange chill crept up the back of his neck, a whisper that the show wasn't quite over. Across the aisle, a pair of security guards exchanged glances as the side doors creaked open. A gust of warm air swept into the church, carrying with it something electric, an energy that made even the most jaded socialite pause. First, no one turned. The minister continued, raising his hands in final blessing. But then a shadow appeared at the threshold, tall and unmistakably familiar, moving with the deliberate confidence of someone who owned every room he entered. The room fell eerily silent, as if time itself had held its breath. Richard Mason stepped into the light, his silver hair combed back, dressed not in burial gray but in a suit the color of storm clouds. His eyes were sharp, the lines on his face deeper than before, but his presence was undeniable. People gasped. A woman near the back dropped her program and covered her mouth. In that instant, the world seemed to tip sideways, and for a heartbeat nobody moved. Cameras clicked, guests craned their necks. It was as if a ghost had walked in to collect the debt that no one knew they owed. For Brandon, the sight of his father standing in the doorway was a death sentence in itself. Every thought scattered. He felt his heart crash against his ribs, icy panic slicing through the thin fabric of confidence he'd spent months weaving. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. Every detail had been planned, every contingency covered. His mind reeled, searching for an explanation, a loophole, some way to make sense of what he was seeing. But there was no escaping the truth. His father was alive, and he had come for him. Richard did not break his stride. Each step echoed against the marble floor, measured and inexorable. He paused only to look out over the congregation, letting their stunned faces etch themselves into his memory. He had built his life on reading people, on knowing when to push, when to wait, when to reveal his hand. Now, in this strangest of homecomings, he saw shock, awe, and more than a few flickers of guilt. This was not a crowd of innocent bystanders. These were witnesses, some complicit, some deceived, all now swept up in a reckoning that would leave none untouched. The silence cracked. A low sob from the front row. A muttered prayer from a business partner who had never truly trusted Brandon. As Richard approached the casket, Brandon stumbled backward, clutching the wood as if it might save him from drowning. His lips parted but no words came. His father's eyes, cold and clear, pinned him in place. Around them, the scene dissolved into a blur of camera flashes and frantic whispers, the air thick with the scent of fear and lilies. No one had seen this coming, not even those who suspected that something about the funeral was wrong. Now the illusion was shattered, and the Mason legacy hung in the balance. Richard's voice, when it came, was low but carried easily across the pews. The words were meant for Brandon, but everyone heard them, and everyone understood. "You started this show, son. Now watch how it ends." In the following seconds, chaos erupted. Some guests rushed for the exits, pushing past one another in a tangle of black coats and expensive shoes. Others just sat frozen, eyes wide, unsure whether to cry or laugh or simply wait for the world to make sense again. But Richard Mason did not flinch. He simply stood beside his own coffin, a living man at his own funeral, and waited for his son to answer for what he had done. In that moment, the boundaries between love and betrayal, between life and death, blurred into something unrecognizable. There was no script for what would come next. There was only the raw, beating heart of a story that had not yet finished telling itself. 7 days before the funeral, Richard Mason awoke to the faint rhythm of rain against the window of his Zurich hotel room. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 5:17 a.m. A dull ache pulsed in his chest, not entirely physical, but somewhere between fatigue and foreboding. He moved slowly, feeling the weight of jet lag and recent surgery settle into his bones. For a moment, there was only the soft hum of the city, distant car horns, the scent of fresh linen, and the persistent drizzle beyond the glass. He reached for his phone, half expecting another barrage of work emails. But the only new message was from his assistant. "Call me as soon as you wake up. Something strange came in from LA. Don't panic." Richard's breath caught. Don't panic. He sat up, pushing aside the covers, and stared at the phone in his trembling hand. It was too early for anyone in California to be sending bad news. Or maybe, as he would soon learn, it was already too late. The call to the assistant took only a minute. Richard listened in silence as she described a series of emails and phone calls. The hospital had called, then the bank, then their lawyer, all asking about his passing, his sudden death. There were condolences, questions about funeral arrangements, legal paperwork in motion. His name, Richard Mason, was appearing on an official death certificate filed in Los Angeles County just hours before. The details, cardiac arrest, Zurich, Switzerland, April 12th, were almost correct. Almost, except for one vital fact. He was still breathing. A rush of adrenaline forced him into action. He called the hospital in LA, demanding answers, but the nurse on the line went silent after reading her screen. "I'm sorry, sir. There must be some mistake. It says here you passed away 2 days ago." The words twisted around him, surreal and hollow. In a haze, Richard asked her to double-check, but the answer was the same. His medical records, updated. His file closed. Officially, Richard Mason was gone. He hung up and stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for answers in tired blue eyes. Behind every line in his face, he saw the years he'd spent building Mason Dynamics, the nights he'd carried Brandon, feverish, down dark hallways, the weekends spent pushing his son's swing, the laughter that once filled their home in Santa Monica. A wave of memories crashed over him. Annette's voice, Long gone but never forgotten. Don't let your work swallow you whole, Richard. Promise me. He had promised in his way. But family, he realized, had always meant more to him than the business he built. It was why he'd forgiven Brandon's failures, why he'd given him second and third chances, why he'd carried the weight for both of them, even as Brandon slipped further from the man he hoped his son would become. Now, staring at the phone, he realized how naive he'd been. He scrolled through his contacts, searching for any hint, any sign of a misunderstanding. There were none. His personal bank account locked. His business account frozen. The family trust transferred to Brandon's oversight, pending probate. The details were precise, legal, inarguable. He felt a rising anger, not just at his son, but at himself. He had opened every door, handed Brandon every key. In his effort to build a legacy, he had enabled his own undoing. Panic gave way to a colder focus. Richard opened his laptop and dug into the digital footprints. Brandon's signature was on the death certificate, filed with the county registrar. There were emails, supposedly from Richard himself, authorizing the release of records, approving transactions, even giving Brandon power of attorney during Richard's illness abroad. The language was convincing, but a single phrase, one Richard never used, revealed the forgery. He read it over and over. Sincerely, R. Mason. He never signed anything that way. He called the lawyer next, Michael Evans, the same man who'd drawn up the family will. Michael sounded nervous, distracted, speaking in a low voice, as if afraid someone might overhear. Richard, I'm so sorry. Brandon insisted you wanted everything handled quietly. I should have called Switzerland, but the documentation was flawless. I even spoke to the American consulate in Zurich. Someone answered your phone. Richard. They said it was your nurse. Richard felt the room tilt around him. His phone, his passwords, his schedule. All compromised. All within reach of the one person he had trusted most. With mounting dread, Richard booked the next flight home, moving like a ghost through the airport, haunted by the thought that he had become a stranger in his own life. In the business class lounge, he scrolled through Brandon's social media, seeing condolences pouring in, photos of Brandon posing with old family friends, his arm around the family lawyer, his expression somber, but his eyes shining with anticipation. In every image, Richard saw the same boy he'd carried on his shoulders, the boy who once promised, "I'll take care of you when you're old, Dad." That promise now sounded like a curse. The flight to New York was long, silent, and restless. He didn't sleep. Instead, he replayed every warning sign he'd ignored. The sudden interest Brandon took in the trust, the strange calls from Swiss numbers, the late-night emails from family advisors. At JFK, Richard stepped into a world that no longer recognized him. His name had been erased from systems, his accounts inaccessible. He used cash, traveled incognito, careful to trust no one. In the city, he stayed with an old friend from college, a retired detective who had seen the worst in people but never, as he admitted, something quite like this. They sat late into the night, piecing together the timeline. Brandon had been planning for months, possibly years, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Richard's surgery had been the opening, the weakness he needed. With his father overseas, Brandon had gained access to every document, every password. He'd hired a hacker, someone who knew how to forge medical documents, create fake calls, spoof numbers. The details, Richard realized, were chillingly precise. There were traces of withdrawals from Swiss banks, a list of properties Brandon was already trying to sell, and a sudden flurry of expensive purchases. Art, watches, a down payment on a penthouse in Miami. Richard felt every blow as both a father and a man who prided himself on control. He saw, with devastating clarity, how easy it had been for Brandon to weaponize the very trust that should have protected them both. Worse, there were clues that someone else inside Mason Dynamics had helped him. Emails from Brandon to the head of compliance, vague references to covering tracks, hush money paid through anonymous crypto transfers. Betrayal, Richard realized, was a contagion. Once it started, it spread silently, infecting even those who owed him their livelihoods. Haunted by the faces of his employees, Richard decided there would be no police. Not yet. The law would come later. For now, he would orchestrate his own resurrection, not just to reclaim his name but to expose every accomplice. He worked quietly with his old detective friend, gathering proof, building a dossier so airtight it would withstand any courtroom scrutiny. They unearthed emails, contracts, bank statements, and flight manifests. They discovered that the day Richard died, Brandon had transferred $5 million into an offshore account, then booked a one-way ticket to Argentina for a week after the funeral. The days blurred together in a haze of planning and adrenaline. Richard barely ate. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. The city outside was bright with the rush of spring, but inside the borrowed apartment, the only light came from computer screens and the slow-burning fire of a father's determination. In moments of exhaustion, he remembered Annette's gentle admonishments, the weight of every choice he'd made, every opportunity he'd given Brandon. He wondered, for the first time, whether all his sacrifices had been worth it. On the eve of the funeral, Richard found himself standing at the edge of Central Park, the hum of traffic in his ears, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. He thought of his own father, a man who'd built nothing, but loved fiercely, and never let pride get in the way of forgiveness. Richard closed his eyes and made a silent vow. He would not allow the Mason legacy to end in darkness, no matter the cost. The morning of the funeral, as the city awoke, Richard Mason dressed in a suit as dark as the doubts that haunted him. He watched the live stream of the service on his phone, listening to Brandon's trembling voice, the eulogies, the tears. The scene was both familiar and utterly foreign. This was the life he'd built. Every friend, every rival, every moment of pride, now being divided like a carcass. He waited, heart hammering, until the exact moment when Brandon stood to accept the applause and condolences of the assembled guests. Then, with a steadying breath, Richard turned off the phone, straightened his tie, and prepared to return to the world as a man who refused to stay dead. He was ready, not just to reclaim his life, but to ensure that the truth, no matter how painful, would rise with him. There would be no forgiveness. There would only be justice. Richard Mason moved like a shadow through the city, every step calculated, every glance over his shoulder loaded with old habits of survival. Years ago, he'd built his company from nothing, brick by digital brick, learning the language of power and deceit. But nothing in business, no boardroom betrayal or high-stakes merger, had prepared him for this, to be hunted and erased by his own blood. He became obsessed with the paper trail Brandon had left, the intricate web of lies that had transformed him from a father to a ghost. Every hour brought a new layer of dread, a deeper ache of recognition at just how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. This was not some corporate rival clawing at his legacy. It was the boy he'd once taught to ride a bike on a cracked Los Angeles sidewalk, now forging signatures with a surgeon's precision. In the borrowed brownstone in Manhattan, Richard spread documents across the kitchen table, the pale morning light turning bank statements and emails into a mosaic of betrayal. He studied them the way he used to study market trends, only this time the stakes weren't quarterly profits, they were everything. Brandon's fingerprints were everywhere, emails with forged authorization codes, transfer orders written in an imitation of Richard's careful, slanting script, text messages sent to lawyers and accountants from Richard's own number. With every new detail, the wound cut deeper. His trust, handed over across decades, had been used as a weapon. For a moment, Richard almost admired the audacity. But admiration soured into anger, then resolve. There was a method to Brandon's madness, a sequence as cold as it was brilliant. The death certificate, filed with the exact language of Zurich hospital records. The power of attorney, signed with digital fingerprints, not a single error in the metadata. Phone calls routed through encrypted apps, faked by someone who'd studied his father's every pattern, every habit. In the quiet of the night, Richard tried to imagine what his son's life must have become, living in the penthouse suite of someone else's inheritance, promising friends the moon, gambling on dreams that could never come true. He could almost feel Brandon's desperation, his need to finally win at something, anything, after a lifetime of second place. But this was no longer about pity. Richard called in favors from old friends, people who owed him not just money, but loyalty born from past rescues and silent understanding. They uncovered a series of encrypted transactions to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. The numbers lined up. 5 million gone the day after his supposed death, funneled through offshore accounts and swept into investments too risky for any reputable bank. There were payments to an anonymous cybersecurity consultant in Miami, one who specialized in digital vanishings. Richard scoured the files and found flight itineraries booked in Brandon's name, cash withdrawals from luxury hotels, meetings with men whose names conjured up nothing but blank LinkedIn pages and rumors. As he pored over these discoveries, Richard found himself haunted not just by the crime, but by the memory of Brandon's childhood. The way Brandon would burst through the door after Little League, dirt on his face, eager for a story or a joke. Those memories stabbed through the fog of the present, mingling hope and regret. He remembered, with sharp clarity, Annette's last words to him in the hospital. "Promise me you'll love him, no matter what." The promise echoed now as both a comfort and a curse. Still, something gnawed at Richard, a faint itch that there was more beneath the surface. He called Michael Evans again, demanding to know who else had been involved in approving the paperwork. Michael hesitated, but finally admitted. A senior compliance officer at Mason Dynamics had signed off on Brandon's access, citing a call from Richard himself, another forged contact. Richard felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He'd always prided himself on rewarding loyalty, and the idea that one of his most trusted employees had been bought, by money or threat, gnawed at what remained of his certainty. Late that night, Richard and his detective friend tailed a black Escalade through Midtown, following a lead to a private poker club where Brandon had been seen 2 weeks before. Inside, the smell of whiskey and adrenaline mixed with the faint buzz of neon. There, in a back room beneath fake crystal chandeliers, they caught a glimpse of Brandon's old roommate from Stanford. Now a shell of a man, fingers twitching, eyes darting to the exit. He recognized Richard and bolted, but not before muttering a single phrase that stuck like a splinter. He said you'd forgive him, no matter what. The next morning, as the city woke to the distant sirens and clatter of garbage trucks, Richard sifted through the residue of his old life. He found a letter from Annette, written years ago, pressed between 2 financial reports. In her careful handwriting, she reminded him, "You can rebuild a business. Don't let pride tear apart a family." He felt the full weight of her words. It wasn't pride that hurt now. It was the absence of the one thing he'd always hoped to pass down, honor, not money. Richard turned his attention to the board of Mason Dynamics. He sent a cryptic message to the company's acting CEO, a woman who'd been with him since their garage days. The reply came fast, cautious, but laced with hope. "I never believed you were gone. Something isn't right here." She agreed to flag any unusual withdrawals or document changes. Richard now had an inside line, a small light in the darkness. He instructed her to quietly notify legal and compliance teams, to keep an eye on Brandon, to freeze any asset transfer Brandon attempted. It was dangerous. If Brandon caught wind, the plan could unravel. But time was running out and Richard was done hiding. With a new surge of determination, he began building a dossier. He collected screenshots, notarized every document, recorded calls with Michael Evans and the compliance officer, even the voicemails left by Brandon, each one sounding more confident, more entitled. He used encrypted drives, stored backups in cloud accounts only he could access. Every click, every entry, felt like both a betrayal and a plea for justice. He knew that whatever happened next would define not just his company, but his legacy as a father. The detective brought news of a private jet, chartered under a shell company connected to Brandon's new girlfriend, a minor Hollywood actress whose career was suddenly, and suspiciously, flush with cash. The flight was booked to leave for Buenos Aires 2 days after the funeral. Richard's hands shook with rage and something deeper, a sense of loss that threatened to hollow him out. He would never get back the years he'd spent believing that love and loyalty could withstand anything. He decided he would confront Brandon not in secret, but in the most public way possible. He wanted the world to see the truth. He would use every weapon at his disposal, evidence, witnesses, the force of his own survival. He remembered, painfully, The night Brandon crashed his father's Lexus and came home reeking of whiskey. Richard had covered for him, paid for silence, protected his son from scandal. In doing so, he taught Brandon that consequences could be evaded, that love meant never facing the full cost of one's mistakes. That lesson had come full circle. Now, as Richard pieced together the final details, he resolved to teach Brandon one last lesson. Justice is not a burden you can offload onto someone else. He worked through the night, assembling the timeline, cross-referencing every transaction, tracing the chain of command that allowed Brandon to become the executor of an estate that was never his to claim. The day before the funeral, Richard met with a trusted journalist, a woman whose career he had once championed, who owed him a favor. He gave her enough information to ensure that, should anything happen to him again, the story would break nationwide, the evidence airtight. She promised to keep it under wraps until the moment was right. Richard now had the power of the press in his corner, and with it, the leverage to force the truth into the light. In the hours before his return to Los Angeles, Richard stood alone on a rooftop, staring out at the city. The skyline flickered with possibility and regret. He wondered, not for the first time, if it would have been easier to simply disappear, to let Brandon run with the money and start over somewhere new. But deep in his chest, beneath the anger and betrayal, burned a stubborn hope that even shattered families could, in some form, be made whole again. Not through forgiveness, but through truth. He booked a red-eye to L.A., using an alias, careful to avoid any surveillance Brandon might have set in place. At the airport, he moved with the calm of a man who had nothing left to lose. On the flight, he barely slept, instead reading Annette's letter over and over, letting her words carve a path through the fog of his grief. When the wheels touched down, Richard Mason knew he was stepping into the final act. He would face Brandon, not as a broken father or a ruined businessman, but as a man who had survived the unthinkable. The world would see, at last, who truly owned the Mason name. The morning Richard Mason walked into his own funeral, the world tilted. For him, it was as if years of pride and regret, love and warning, loyalty and disappointment all collided into one defining heartbeat. He waited behind the last row of marble columns, the weight of evidence in his jacket pocket, his heart thundering with something more complicated than anger. Every instinct, every lesson from decades of ruthless business deals told him to keep his composure. But nothing could prepare him for the reality of facing the son he'd spent a lifetime building, the son whose face would soon be exposed to the world as both victim and villain. He drew in a steady breath, the same way he once prepared for closing the biggest deal of his career, and pushed open the heavy church doors. A hush fell. The faint melody from the organ stuttered and died as every head turned. Some people gasped, others pressed hands to their mouths. For a split second, the crowded church felt smaller than a courtroom, smaller than a confession booth. Richard let the silence stretch. The man everyone thought dead was alive, and the reckoning was here. He walked down the aisle, feeling the pressure of every gaze, the shifting shock in the air. Whispers rippled like wind through leaves, some calling his name in disbelief, some murmuring prayers, others just frozen in place, unable to reconcile the impossible with what they saw. The front, Brandon swayed. He was rigid, white-knuckled, eyes wide as if he'd seen a ghost, though it was more than that. It was the look of someone whose entire reality was collapsing. The casket, closed and polished, stood as a monument to deceit. Richard passed it, his eyes never leaving his son. He didn't speak yet. Instead, he turned and faced the congregation, drawing on every ounce of presence he had honed over decades. He saw old friends, employees, rivals, even strangers who'd followed the Mason legacy for years. He saw, above all, the uncertainty that threaded the room together. In that uncertain silence, truth would finally break the surface. The funeral director moved as if to intercept, but Richard's voice cut through the tension. Calm, resonant, undeniable. "I suppose I should thank you all for coming." Some laughter, nervous, scattered through the rows. He raised a hand, silencing the reaction. The moment was his. He began not with accusations, but with a story, a memory of Brandon as a boy, clinging to his father's hand after falling from a tree. The crowd listened, rapt, as Richard described the lessons he tried to teach his son about getting up after a fall, about the real cost of trust and forgiveness. It was more than spectacle. Richard wanted the truth exposed in the full glare of the people who mattered most, so no one, least of all Brandon, could twist it again. He moved through the crowd's confusion, taking out copies of emails, notarized statements, photographs, bank transfers. Each detail he presented, he spoke softly, almost regretfully, as if he was narrating the autopsy of his own family. Brandon's face drained of color with every page that changed hands, every whisper that grew sharper with realization. Some guests stood, staring as though they'd witnessed resurrection and betrayal in a single instant. Brandon tried to speak, stumbling through excuses and denials, his voice echoing off the church walls, shrill and unsteady. But Richard's words, now hard and unwavering, left no room for misinterpretation. He spoke of the hacking, the fake signatures, the bribes, the hidden money, the betrayal not just of a father, but of every value he tried to instill. Every time Brandon tried to answer, Richard pressed on, laying out the final damning evidence. The planned escape to Argentina, the shell accounts, the manipulation of company insiders. It was not just about exposing a crime. It was about dragging the Mason name out from beneath the weight of lies, forcing everyone present to confront the truth. There was pain in every word, every accusation, but Richard refused to flinch. He described the agony of realizing too late the price of unconditional love, of wondering if the greatest crime was his own, having taught Brandon that forgiveness could be infinite. A police officer, waiting by the doors, stepped forward. The detective friend Richard had trusted for years handed over the final stack of evidence to the authorities, and a warrant was read aloud. It was done with the dignity Richard demanded. No handcuffs, no spectacle, just the clear, cold announcement that Brandon Mason was under investigation for fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The crowd erupted. Shock, anger, sorrow, relief. Some looked away, unable to watch a legacy unravel. Others reached for Richard, quietly offering support, their faith in him renewed by the courage it took to return from the dead for the sake of truth. Richard's eyes never left Brandon. In that final moment, when his son looked up, pleading and broken, Richard saw not a monster, but the child he'd once carried through the night after a nightmare. He wanted, more than anything, to find some fragment of redemption in Brandon's eyes, some hint that all was not lost. But the distance between them was an ocean. There would be no quick repair, no simple reconciliation. Love, like trust, had been fractured too deeply. Outside, news crews jostled for position as word spread. A titan had returned from the grave, and his own son would be the story. Richard faced the questions with calm, letting the cameras record the gravity of what had happened. He answered only the facts, careful not to gloat or attack. He owed that much to the father he had once tried to be, and to the son who, despite everything, had once believed the world was theirs to share. As Brandon was led away, the finality of the act settled on the room like dust after a storm. Some in the crowd wept openly. Others argued in hushed voices, debating guilt and justice, the boundary between love and punishment. The Mason dynasty was changed forever, and everyone present understood they'd witnessed more than the fall of a family. They'd seen the cost of unchecked ambition, and the tragedy that follows when legacy becomes a weapon instead of a gift. When the church emptied, Richard stood alone by the casket that was meant to bury his name. He placed a hand on the cool wood, letting the silence wrap around him. He mourned, not just for the son he'd lost, but for the father he had failed to be. In that grief, there was a strange freedom, a sense that the truth, though bitter, could finally let the living breathe again. The story was no longer just his or Brandon's. It belonged to everyone who had ever loved, lost, and learned that some things, once broken, can only be healed by facing the darkness together. Richard Mason did not sleep the night after the funeral. He sat by the window in the suite the police had booked for him, his eyes unfocused, the city lights of Los Angeles blurring into streaks of gold and blue. The church, the cameras, the bitter taste of public justice. They all replayed in his mind, twisting into something stranger than relief, stranger than victory. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Brandon's face. First defiant, then desperate, then hollowed out and empty as the police led him away through the crowd. The room felt too large, too quiet. All that noise outside, media trucks, reporters, the hum of a city hungry for scandal, was nothing compared to the storm inside his chest. He thought of Annette's letter, the one he'd found tucked between old balance sheets. This paper was thin and fragile, the handwriting steady, certain. She had written about forgiveness, about the danger of pride, about the risk of loving someone who might never return the favor. He remembered holding Brandon as a baby, watching the world shrink to the size of a heartbeat. He remembered the laughter and the arguments, the moments he'd tried to teach his son how to stand up and start over. None of that mattered now. The world wanted answers. The world wanted punishment. Richard felt as if he were watching himself from a distance, trapped between rage and regret. The morning after, the news broke like a flood. The living dead case, they called it, headlines flashing across every screen. There was footage of the confrontation, shaky cell phone videos of Richard's arrival, the stunned faces of the mourners, the moment Brandon tried to run. Analysts debated motive. Talk shows tore apart every detail of the Mason family. Some commentators called Richard a hero, a symbol of American resilience. Others whispered about parental neglect, about how the hunger for success could poison even the closest bond. Overnight, the Mason name became a household word, a punchline and a cautionary tale. But justice did not move as quickly as the press. There were hearings, depositions, tense calls with attorneys. Richard sat across from prosecutors answering questions about company protocol, about trust funds, about the chain of custody for every signature, every email, every withdrawal. Each detail was another pin pushed into a map of betrayal. In the courtroom, Brandon looked smaller than Richard remembered. His expensive suit wrinkled, his eyes dull, the arrogance drained away. The judge listened impassively as the lawyers made their case, presenting evidence with a clarity that left little room for hope. Richard felt none of the satisfaction he'd expected. Every admission, every cross-examination, chipped away at his resolve. He had set this machine in motion, exposing Brandon, demanding consequences, insisting the truth be made public. Now, in the harsh light of the courtroom, he wondered what it meant to win. He thought about legacy, not just money or reputation, but the messy, invisible legacy of pain and expectation passed from parent to child. Brandon, once the bright, unspoiled boy with a crooked smile, had become a stranger Richard barely recognized. Was it fate? Was it the choices he'd made or failed to make? The questions twisted through him, unanswerable. The jury reached a verdict in less than a week. Guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, the forfeiture of all inheritance rights. The judge pronounced the sentence: 5 years probation, restitution of misappropriated assets, and a permanent ban on managing any Mason family property or trust. There was no applause, no relief, just a deep, aching silence as the gavel fell. Brandon's attorney promised an appeal, but everyone in the room knew the case had already been decided in the court of public opinion. Richard left the courthouse to a gauntlet of cameras. Reporters shouted questions about Brandon, about forgiveness, about what he would do next. He answered with the same careful dignity he'd practiced for years, refusing to gloat, refusing to condemn. When a young journalist asked him if he was proud of what he'd done, Richard paused. "No father wants to bury his own son's future," he said. "But sometimes the truth is the only thing that can set us free." The words echoed in the air, captured and replayed 1,000 times that afternoon. But in his heart, Richard was not free. He carried the weight of every mistake, every moment he had chosen work over family, every warning he'd ignored until it was too late. The weeks that followed blurred together. Investors called to congratulate him. Studios fought for the rights to his story. Stock in Mason Dynamics soared. Legal teams combed through every contract, every asset, untangling the knots Brandon had left behind. Yet each victory felt hollow, each windfall a reminder of all he'd lost. Richard walked the halls of his company like a man in exile. Employees averted their eyes, their respect tinged with pity. Old friends reached out, offering condolences as if he had suffered a bereavement instead of a betrayal. Richard met with Annette's sister in a quiet cafe near Venice Beach. She looked at him over her coffee, her gaze gentle but unyielding. "He was never as strong as you thought," she said quietly. "You built him up to be you, but he never wanted that." Her words stung. He realized, with a painful clarity, that the need to create a worthy successor had blinded him to the real needs of the boy he had loved. Brandon had always felt the weight of expectation, the silent pressure to become a man he could never be. A letter arrived in the mail a week after the sentencing, written in Brandon's uneven hand. The words were short, stilted, and full of longing. "I'm sorry for everything. I know I can't fix what I broke. I hope you find peace. I'm going away for a while. Don't look for me." Richard read it in the quiet of his study, sunlight falling through the window, dust motes drifting in the air. He thought of writing back, of trying to bridge the chasm between them, but the words would not come. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, through action, through silence, through the irrevocable decisions that had led them to this moment. Richard attended the first day of filming for the movie based on his story. The set was full of strangers, actors pretending at intimacy, directors adjusting the lights to mimic heartbreak. He watched a man in makeup stand by a casket, his posture mirroring the way Richard had stood in that church, surrounded by ghosts and the living alike. The fiction of it all felt surreal, almost laughable. Richard wondered what lesson people would draw from the spectacle, what comfort or warning they would find in his pain. Maybe, he thought, there was no lesson, only the truth, as messy and unresolved as it had always been. In the months that followed, Richard began to untangle his life from the machinery of business and scandal. He sold his remaining shares in Mason Dynamics, donated a portion of the proceeds to a foundation for children of incarcerated parents. He packed up the house in Beverly Hills, sending most of his possessions to auction. He moved north to a smaller home in Napa Valley, surrounded by silence and old vineyards. The past was never far behind. Every morning, he took long walks among the vines, letting the world settle around him, remembering the man he had been before ambition devoured everything else. Sometimes, as dusk fell and the hills turned gold, Richard would take out Annette's letter and read it again. He wondered what she would have made of all this, whether she would have found a way to forgive Brandon, to forgive him. He hoped so. He thought of the generations that would come after, of the legacy he would leave, not in money or fame, but in the willingness to face the truth, no matter how painful. One evening, Richard received a call from his old friend, the detective who had helped him unravel the web of betrayal. They spoke for a long time about justice, about the cost of doing what was right. "You didn't just save your fortune," the friend said. "You saved yourself." Richard hung up, feeling something close to gratitude. In the quiet of his new life, there was space for hope. Not redemption, he was too old to believe in fairy tales, but the chance, at last, to live honestly. In his final act, Richard Mason stood not as the architect of a dynasty, but as a man stripped bare by loss and truth. He understood, finally, that every victory leaves scars, and that some wounds never heal. But in the silence of the vineyards, in the long, empty evenings, he discovered a peace that had eluded him all his life. A peace born not from winning, but from facing the darkness and stepping into the light. When the world stopped watching, when the cameras shut off and the headlines faded, Richard Mason found himself truly alone for the first time in decades. His new home in Napa Valley was smaller and quieter than any place he'd ever lived, a world away from the city's noise and from the golden cage of Beverly Hills. Some mornings, he woke before dawn and wandered the rows of grapevines as mist curled over the hills. He tried to let the rhythm of the land slow the chaos inside his mind. Each step through the dew was a meditation, an attempt to settle the old battles and restless ghosts that had haunted him since the day he stood in that church and watched the truth unravel. He carried a strange fame now, something at once heavy and hollow. Strangers in town would sometimes approach him at the market or the post office, hesitant and wide-eyed, as if they'd stumbled on a character who had stepped out of a myth and into their morning errands. Most only wanted a word, a handshake, a smile, some small proof that he was real, that the story of the Mason family hadn't simply ended with a flicker of headlines and the next big scandal. He gave them what he could, a polite nod, a gentle word. He learned to turn away the interview requests, to refuse the invitations from news producers and talk show hosts. He had told his story on screen, on the record, to the court, to the world. He was done repeating it for applause. But moving on proved harder than he'd expected. Each time he passed the old, sunlit photographs in the hallway, the memories pressed close. There was Brandon as a boy, his laughter caught forever in a frozen frame. The kind of joy that made Richard ache for all he'd lost and all he'd never truly had. Some afternoons, he would stand for long minutes with Annette's letter in his hands, reading and rereading the same lines until the words blurred. He tried to forgive himself, but forgiveness never came easily. The wounds, so public and so raw, did not close just because the world had moved on. The film about his life went into production, its script punched up with dramatic license and a glossy promise of catharsis. Actors portrayed him and Brandon, their faces pale imitations of the real people, their sorrows rehearsed in trailers and on set. The director called him for input, asking if this line or that scene felt honest. Richard would listen, sometimes offering a correction, sometimes just letting them run with the fantasy. Art, he knew, could never capture the gritty, uneven truth of real betrayal, of love gone rotten and loyalty shattered. But he also understood the need for stories, for closure, even if it was only for the audience, not for himself. When the film finally premiered in Los Angeles, Richard stood at the edge of the theater lobby, watching the swirl of industry chatter and flashing lights. For a moment, it all felt unbearably surreal, as if he were attending someone else's funeral, or a celebration for a man who'd never truly lived. He shook hands with executives, smiled for the cameras, answered questions about redemption and justice and what it meant to forgive. But inside, he felt like a guest at his own wake, a silent witness to the strange afterlife that awaited those who'd lived through too much and survived to tell the tale. In the quiet that followed, Richard began to understand something he'd never fully grasped before. Justice, even when served, was never clean. Victory always carried a cost, and that cost was often invisible, paid in sleepless nights and quiet regrets, in the distance that grew between those left standing. He kept to himself, turning down board seats, walking away from the offers to advise, to mentor, to teach. His name, once synonymous with Mason dynamics, now lived in the footnotes of corporate textbooks and the trivia rounds of late-night television. Months slipped by. One evening in September, Richard received an unexpected letter. The handwriting was familiar, though shaky, as if the writer had struggled over each word. It was from Brandon. The letter was brief, just a few lines, but every syllable burned. Brandon wrote that he was living quietly in the Midwest, working a simple job, trying to put himself back together. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but he said he understood now what it meant to lose everything, what it meant to be given more chances than he deserved. He ended with a wish for Richard's peace, an acknowledgement that some things couldn't be fixed, but maybe, over time, could be remembered without bitterness. Richard sat with the letter for a long time, feeling the tremor of old pain mixed with something like hope. He wrote back, careful with his words, offering no promises, no judgments. Just a line or two to say he'd read the letter, that he was alive, that he hoped Brandon found a way to make something good out of what was left. It was not reconciliation, but it was a step, an uneasy truce, a possibility that maybe the future didn't have to mirror the past. Sometimes, on long walks beneath the spreading oaks, Richard would see families picnicking in the fields, fathers and sons tossing a baseball or arguing about the rules of some made-up game. He felt a bittersweet ache, a memory of a time before legacy became burden and ambition turned love into currency. In these moments, he did not pity himself or wish for a different story. Instead, he felt the rough edges of acceptance. Life was not a fable. Some mistakes were too big to undo, some truths too heavy to forget. But the world kept turning, And in the small, ordinary kindnesses of strangers and the hush of the valley at dusk, there were still pieces of grace to be found. The story of Richard Mason faded, as all stories do, replaced by new headlines, new scandals, new families fighting over new fortunes. But in Napa Valley, where the vines grew thick and the mornings started in silence, Richard built a life that was his alone. He found friends in unexpected places, a retired schoolteacher, a pair of brothers who ran the local bakery, a widow who painted wildflowers on stones and left them by the riverbank for children to find. He learned, finally, to ask for help, to listen without needing to fix, to share a meal without rushing to judgment. On the first anniversary of the day he rose from the dead, Richard visited Annette's grave. He placed her letter among the flowers, stood for a long while with the early autumn sun on his shoulders, and spoke aloud the words he wished he'd said years ago, that he was sorry, that he had tried his best, that in the end, love and forgiveness were all that ever truly mattered. He did not expect an answer. He walked home in the golden light, thinking of the future as something soft, unformed, waiting for him to shape it. As the seasons changed and the world spun on, Richard Mason lived in the tension between regret and possibility, between the shadow of what had been lost and the promise of what might still be found. He understood now that justice was not a destination but a journey, that peace was something built slowly, one day, one step, one honest conversation at a time. And in that quiet, in that new beginning, there was at last the sense, not of triumph, not of vindication, but of a life reclaimed, imperfect and unfinished, still worthy of hope.